2 days after my mom passed, I found myself sitting here in these pews, dizzied by a range of emotions and simultaneously feeling nothing at all. I showed up here looking for something, anything, to tether me back to earth. I sat right there next to my husband, Tony, both hearing and not hearing the words being spoken in the way that children hear adults in the Charlie Brown cartoons. I wondered if this is what normal felt like now. Is this what life after loss will be? I came rocketing back to myself to the sound of a phone ringing in the middle of the sermon, even though every service we are reminded to silence our devices. Another ring, and folks stiffened, trying not to turn and look. They'll mute it soon, we all thought, silently, in unison. The ringing continued, and folks started to glance around. I looked down the pew, my irritation rising, and yet no one moved to silence the sound. I started scanning the faces of the folks nearest us, nearest the ringing, wondering, how do they not know it's their phone ringing? Then the longest second passed, and all at once I was digging into my bag, which also contained my mom's bag, which also contained her cell phone, which I had not taken a moment to consider might not be silenced. My fingers flew to open that last zipper, grab the phone, and smash the buttons to turn off my mother's Sunday morning alarm, reminding her to take her pills. Now I was the one receiving those sideways glances, the culprit finally revealed. I turned several shades of red, staring at my bag that held the purse, which held my dead mother's phone, with the alarm she had silenced herself a week earlier. And through my embarrassment, I thought, someday, this is gonna be kind of funny. And then I laughed, quietly, to myself at the absurdity of it all. How ridiculous that a person can be there and then they are not, but their cell phone is. And it rings in church. It just became more and more funny to me, that ringing phone, and that was my tether back to earth. Nora McInerney is a podcast host and writer who unintentionally became those things. When her father died, she had a miscarriage, and her husband died of brain cancer within the span of a few months. Her husband's obituary became national news because it was funny. And soon, Nora was becoming an inspiration to people who had gone through awful things but didn't feel connected to the everything happens for a reason of it all and the Hallmark quotes. They wanted that realness, relatability, and the ability to both laugh and cry. She started an online group called the Hot Young Widows Club, which soon became the title of her book. She gave a TED Talk. She wrote several more books titled No Happy Endings, It's Okay to Laugh, Crying is Okay Too, and most recently, Bad Vibes Only. Her podcast, Terrible, Thanks for Asking, is described as a show that lets real people get real honest about how they're really doing. It's sometimes sad, sometimes funny, and almost always both. Both. It's the both that people need. A space to bring the messy humanity of grief and loss and still living and needing to feel but not wanting to, but knowing it's that feeling, not the numbing, that lets us take a step forward. Of course, we experience grief for a myriad of reasons. The loss of a person or a pet, the ending of a partnership or a friendship, the loss of a job or a home, grieving for our planet and climate change, grief tied to racial justice or the lack thereof, grief for the loss of human rights, pandemic grief. There is both individual grief and communal grief. It can feel incredibly heavy or leave us feeling empty. It builds inside us. I picture it like a balloon increasing in size over time. And it's often joy, a hug from a dear friend, a funny line that catches you by surprise, or noticing spring blooms that weren't there the day before. It's those little joyful moments that help to deflate that balloon. Not all the way and not forever, but it brings the pressure down. It brings relief. As I was contemplating this intersection of grief and joy, my dear friend and fellow First Church member, Susie Seidelman, shared this. After my dad died, I was a mess, but kind of didn't understand that yet. I would stay up late every night, watching movies after Luke had gone to bed, and one day I decided to purchase my favorite Kool-Aid flavor from my youth to drink while I watched movies. That night I watched Amelie. It was spirit-lifting and sweet and tender, and it made me cry and cry, which I desperately needed. When it was over, I went to the bathroom to get ready for bed. I turned on the light, looked in the mirror, and I had a massive red Kool-Aid mustache. I absolutely cracked up. It was so cathartic, having just bawled my eyes out and then cracking up on top of it, all along a loosely stitched theme of childhood memories. The problem with grief is many have been taught to believe it has a finite start and end. We are supposed to go through the stages: shock, denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, and then it's complete. We can go back to life as it was before, but that's not what grieving people experience. We're more complex than that. When we've experienced loss, it can feel like our lives have stopped while the rest of the world moves forward. When is the appropriate time to join the world again? There's no right answer, and the hard truth is that grief doesn't end. It changes and reforms and undulates up and down, coming and going in waves. Grief brings us back to our original hurts, makes us fear what might come in the future, and becomes part of us, always. And it reminds us of joy. Grieving a person or an experience or a time in our life means there is something to miss. To grieve is to have loved. There was something wonderful there. Grief may take its place, but we can transform some of that grief into appreciation for what we loved in the first place. Sometimes it feels like grief happens to us from the outside. But if we learn to own it, walk alongside it, choose how to position it, not as a verb, but a noun, there is possibility for deeper connection and understanding of our hurt, our sadness, our longing, our pain, and there's a choice to be made on how we move with grief. For me, I've chosen to allow the joy within the sadness. There's no one right way to grieve, which also means there's no one right way or time to begin laughing or finding joy again. As Nora McInerney says, we don't move on from grief, we move forward with it. My mom died in the very early mornings of Friday, March 20th, 2015. My brother Nate and I had left her hospice room a few hours prior to get some sleep at our respective homes. But having spent her career in the medical field, we think she chose to go without us by her side to spare us from that particular memory. Even so, we rushed back to the hospital to say our final goodbyes. That week had been the most time my brother and I had spent together, probably since childhood. And even though Mom had now passed, we still felt that pull to continue sharing space. We regrouped at my Bayview apartment and found ourselves in a rotation of general chit-chat, silent sadness, and service planning. It was a continuation of what we'd done all week. We sat at her side, talking with her and sharing memories, laughing. And then as she started slipping away, we continued the rotation of quiet contemplation, sharing stories, still finding some laughter, though our laughs felt stunted. We'd start laughing, then remember where we were, what we were doing, and the joke would pass prematurely. Back at my apartment, my brother suddenly sat up and said, "Oh, I need to go grab something from my truck. I'll be right back." As he exited the room, I rushed to the kitchen to grab some flour. See, my brother and I were latchkey kids. Mom was a paramedic, then a nurse, and Dad a police officer. They worked odd shifts, and as soon as we seemed old enough, we were often home alone with a reminder of the rules, meals in the freezer, and a chore list, which we inevitably would avoid until Mom called to say she was on her way home. In our hours alone, dodging those chores, we would overdose on fruit snacks and cartoons and pranks. If my brother stepped outside to grab the mail, I'd push him through the doorway and lock him out of the house. If I took a shower, he'd barge in with a cold bucket of water and throw it over the curtain. Phone call for the other? Definitely make up something embarrassing and yell, "Amanda, the phone's for you and you forgot to flush the toilet." But our favorite prank was antiquing. For those unacquainted, antiquing involves hiding from a person or approach them while they sleep and throwing a handful of flour in their face. It makes a tiny little sound and a giant mess. The antiqued person often takes a stunned moment before realizing what had happened. Immature? Yes. Childish? Yes. But we were immature children, and it was hilarious. So that night, I returned from the kitchen with a fistful of flour, my brother's wife and my husband Tony looking at me incredulously as I hid near the front door and shushed them to stop blowing my cover. Nate walked in the door, took a few steps into the room, and I jumped out and tossed the flour directly in his face. There was a silent beat as he realized what had happened, and then we laughed. I dropped to the floor, him to a chair, and we laughed and laughed and laughed. We cried too, maybe a little from the grief, but mostly from the joy. That fistful of flour brought us back to the place in our past when it was just us together, sharing very little worry and a whole lot of joy. Our mom's death was complicated, just like her life. We'd been in and out of strained relationship due to mental illness and substance abuse, which led her to her young death at 55. Many of the platitudes that come with the loss of a parent were hard to hear, even when they came with good intentions. "She must have been wonderful," they'd say, "to have raised such a great woman like you." Yes, there were incredible moments, but there were really painful ones too. "I'm sure you're feeling sad," they'd say. And yes, I was sad, but I was also relieved to be free from caring for a mentally ill parent. I have very hard memories from my mom, but there was also joy. We often found humor in everyday experiences, like losing your car in the parking lot, or the faces that you make when you're trying to open a stuck jar. We would often laugh until we cried. Cheryl Strayed, famed columnist of Dear Sugar and author of books Wild, Torch, Brave Enough, and Tiny Beautiful Things, told a story from when she served as a youth advocate at a middle school. She led a group of young girls, many with very challenging histories and familial circumstances, in a support group of sorts, and invited them to start journaling. Through this, she learned that one particular girl was experiencing some horrific physical abuse at the hands of her mother's boyfriend. Strayed reported it to Child Protective Services, but soon realized they were going to do nothing more than document it. So the next time she saw the young girl and heard yet another awful story from her home life, she recounted, "I told her it was not okay, that it was unacceptable, and that I would call and report this latest horrible thing. But I did not tell her it would stop. I did not promise anyone would intervene, that it would likely go on and she would have to survive it. She'd have to find a way within herself to not only escape the terribleness, but transcend it. She had to grab like a drowning girl to every good thing that came her way, and she had to swim like hell away from every bad thing. She had to count the years, let them roll by, grow up, and then run as far as she could in the direction of her best and happiest dreams across the bridge that was built by her own desire to heal. Run in the direction of your best and happiest dreams across the bridge that is built by your own desire to heal." That right there. Our bridge to our best and happiest dreams does not erase our grief. It's made of it, molded and sealed by our desire to heal. Abby Wambach, author and retired American soccer player, said, "There are a few moments in life where we have the clarity that all our heartache is worth it." I had one of those moments when we scattered my mom's ashes. My brother and I scattered our mom's ashes in a beautiful place in the way that most people do, without a permit. We went to a nearby county park where we'd spent many happy childhood days, after many years of contemplating the best location and honestly delaying any activity which would again make us face the finality of her life. By this time, Nate and I both had our own children, the grandkids she dreamed of having. We pushed them in their strollers to a spot we deemed appropriate and out of eyesight from park staff, and began preparing the cremains. Not only were we spreading Mom's ashes, but also the remains of all our childhood pets. 3 cats, 3 dogs, and a guinea pig, as requested by our mother. I held that bag, looked at my brother, and said, "Okay, ready?" He nodded. Had either of us taken into consideration the direction of the wind that day? No, we did not. So as we introduced Mom and our pets to their final resting place, they blew back into our faces and onto our clothes. As we jumped out of the way, I yelled, "She would!" You see, our mom had a knack for both occasionally inappropriate attachment to us as her kids and for doing silly things in serious moments. So this just fit. Of course. Again, we found ourselves laughing. It wouldn't have felt right, that moment, to only be solemn. There needed to be a little mess, a little laugh, to make it feel true and real. My dear friends, life is hard. There are no guarantees. There is a lot to question, a lot to carry. But there is also a whole lot of love. Also, this is the key word here: grief and also joy, longing and also laughter. They can coexist. They should coexist. I say all of this knowing it's not easy. Joy can't be assumed. It's not guaranteed. But if you look for it, even a tiny bit of it, you'll find it's there. And once you feel it, once you experience that sweet levity that comes from hope and release and connectedness and the realization that joy is often what brought us to this place of grief, it grows. Remember, grief is inevitable, but so is a stunning amount of joy.